The United States and Saudi Arabia are moving toward a framework for civil nuclear cooperation that has drawn intense global scrutiny because it could reshape nuclear non-proliferation norms and energy cooperation in the Middle East. Under U.S. law, nuclear cooperation with other nations is governed by Section 123 of the Atomic Energy Act, which requires a specific agreement, commonly called a 123 agreement, before the U.S. can transfer nuclear materials, technology, or expertise to another country. Historically, 123 agreements have included stringent non-proliferation conditions designed to ensure that nuclear cooperation serves exclusively peaceful purposes by requiring the partner state to forego enrichment of uranium and reprocessing of spent fuel, and to adopt rigorous International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards, such as the Additional Protocol. The most often cited example of such a high standard is the agreement between the United States and the United Arab Emirates, in which the UAE committed to forego enrichment and reprocessing and accepted the most intrusive IAEA inspection regime, a benchmark often described as the gold standard for non-proliferation in nuclear cooperation agreements. In contrast, the proposed U.S. Saudi agreement that the Trump administration is advancing appears to diverge from this historical practice. According to a document sent to Congress and reviewed by Reuters, the draft U.S.-Saudi Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement would not include certain non-proliferation guardrails that previous administrations and many lawmakers have long insisted be part of any such pact. These include explicit prohibitions on Saudi Arabia pursuing uranium enrichment and reprocessing capabilities, as well as the adoption of the IAEA's Additional Protocol, which grants inspectors broader access to nuclear facilities and activities. Administration officials contend that the deal would still embed U.S. industry at the core of Saudi Arabia's civil nuclear development and would attach additional safeguards and verification measures to certain sensitive activities, which they argue would mitigate proliferation risks. The absence of some traditional safeguards in the draft agreement has raised concerns among arms control groups, lawmakers from both parties, and non-proliferation experts, who warn that allowing a major regional power like Saudi Arabia to develop civil nuclear capabilities without limits on fuel cycle technologies could weaken global norms designed to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and set a precedent for other states to seek similar concessions. The proposed U.S. Saudi nuclear cooperation deal, as described in the document provided to the U.S. Congress, marks a notable departure from long-established U.S. non-proliferation practices by omitting key restrictions that have traditionally been demanded in similar agreements. Under past U.S. administrations, any civil nuclear cooperation with countries seeking technology and materials from the United States included stipulations that Saudi Arabia would not develop domestic uranium enrichment or reprocessing capabilities, the most sensitive elements of the nuclear fuel cycle that can be used to produce materials suitable for nuclear weapons. Crucially, the draft agreement reported to Congress does not explicitly enshrine such prohibitions. Instead, the document refers to additional safeguards and verification measures that would apply to the most sensitive areas of potential nuclear cooperation between the United States and Saudi Arabia, including enrichment, conversion, fuel fabrication, and reprocessing. This phrasing suggests that the United States is prepared to accept some form of Saudi involvement in these technologies, albeit under enhanced monitoring, rather than outright bans. The report also indicates that the proposed deal would rely on a bilateral safeguards arrangement between the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, rather than requiring Saudi Arabia to implement the IAEA's Additional Protocol, which offers the most intrusive inspection authorities available under international safeguards. The Additional Protocol allows inspectors to conduct unannounced inspections and access undeclared sites, tools that non-proliferation advocates argue are vital to verifying the peaceful use of nuclear programs. The absence of this more rigorous regime, coupled with the possibility that Saudi Arabia could pursue enrichment capabilities domestically, represents a shift in U.S. strategy. Supporters of the deal argue that by placing U.S. industry at the center of Saudi Arabia's nuclear development, there will be inherent oversight and influence over how nuclear technology is used, which in their view can reduce proliferation risks and strengthen U.S. strategic interests. They also point out that the agreement is framed as a civil nuclear cooperation deal focused on peaceful energy use and economic benefits, including expanding U.S. influence in the global civilian nuclear energy market. However, critics emphasize that without the clear non-proliferation restraints historically associated with U.S. 123 agreements, the pact would weaken international norms and could encourage other states to press for similar concessions, undercutting long-standing efforts to prevent the spread of enrichment and reprocessing technologies that have dual civilian and military applications. The departure from traditional non-proliferation conditions in the proposed U.S. Saudi civil nuclear cooperation deal has catalyzed sharp concerns from arms control experts, international observers, and many U.S. lawmakers who fear that relaxing guardrails could undermine global efforts to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. The proliferation risk stems from the fact that uranium enrichment and reprocessing are not solely civilian technologies. They're central components of a nuclear fuel cycle, but are also pathways to producing fissile materials for nuclear weapons if improperly safeguarded. For decades, U.S. nuclear cooperation agreements have sought to restrict partner states from pursuing these technologies independently by requiring commitments to forego them and to adopt comprehensive IAEA inspections regimes. The potential omission of such restraints in the U.S. Saudi deal has led non-proliferation organizations to warn that it could create a precedent for other countries seeking similar concessions, thereby weakening the gold standard framework that had become a benchmark for peaceful nuclear cooperation agreements. Saudi Arabia's strategic position in the Middle East further complicates the calculations. The kingdom has repeatedly signaled that it would seek nuclear weapons if Iran, a regional rival with an advanced nuclear program and a history of tensions with Saudi Arabia, were to develop them. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has publicly stated that if Iran acquires nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia would feel compelled to follow suit, a declaration that heightens anxiety among non-proliferation advocates about Riyadh's long-term intentions and the potential for a nuclear arms race in the region. The proposed deal arrives against a backdrop of renewed concerns about global proliferation as traditional arms control agreements between the United States and other major powers have weakened or expired, and as countries like China continue to expand their own nuclear arsenals. Critics argue that allowing Saudi Arabia greater access to sensitive nuclear technologies without strict limits could accelerate regional proliferation dynamics, as states may perceive nuclear capabilities as essential to their security in a volatile strategic environment. They also caution that even enhanced bilateral safeguards and verification measures, without the comprehensive inspection powers of the IAEA's additional protocol, may not be sufficient to detect or deter diversion of nuclear material or activities toward weapons programs. In light of these concerns, many experts urge that any nuclear cooperation agreement with Saudi Arabia must include robust, verifiable, and enforceable non-proliferation conditions that go beyond commercial or strategic incentives and align with international best practices for monitoring and transparency. In the United States, nuclear cooperation agreements are not implemented solely at the discretion of the executive branch. They're subject to oversight and review by Congress, which has the authority to block agreements that raise serious national security, strategic, or non-proliferation concerns. Once a proposed 123 agreement is submitted to Congress, lawmakers have 90 days of continuous session to review the text. During that period, they may introduce and vote on resolutions of disapproval. If both chambers of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, pass resolutions opposing the agreement, it cannot take effect. However, if Congress fails to act within the statutory review period, the agreement automatically goes into force. In the case of the proposed U.S. Saudi civil nuclear cooperation deal, the Trump administration informed Congress of its intention to pursue the agreement and has reportedly prepared to formally transmit the draft text by a specified deadline. This notification triggered a fresh debate on Capitol Hill over whether the agreement, as currently drafted, is consistent with long-standing U.S. policy on non-proliferation and national security interests. A broad spectrum of lawmakers from both parties have expressed concern about removing fundamental safeguards, such as explicit bans on uranium enrichment and reprocessing, as well as the failure to require the IAEA's additional protocol. Some members of Congress have urged the administration to insist on strong non-proliferation commitments before moving forward, warning that a weaker agreement could set a dangerous precedent and erode bipartisan consensus on nuclear security issues. These concerns are not limited to one political faction. They reflect a long-standing bipartisan belief in the necessity of constraining the spread of technologies that could contribute to weapons programs. At the same time, supporters of the agreement argue that it would deepen economic ties between the United States and Saudi Arabia, promote U.S. leadership in the global civilian nuclear energy market, and help secure strategic influence in a region of critical geopolitical importance. They also assert that embedding U.S. industry and oversight into Saudi Arabia's nuclear development could provide transparency and access that limit proliferation risks more effectively than excluding the kingdom from cooperation altogether. The dynamic in Congress over the deal will therefore hinge on how lawmakers balance these competing considerations, economic and strategic benefits against non-proliferation imperatives, and whether they believe the additional safeguards described by the administration provide sufficient protection without traditional guardrails. As the review period unfolds, analysts anticipate intense hearings, briefings from arms control experts, testimony from administration officials, and potential legislative proposals to modify or reject the agreement if its terms are seen as falling short of established non-proliferation standards. The implications of the proposed U.S. Saudi civil nuclear cooperation deal extend beyond bilateral relations and U.S. domestic politics to broader global strategic dynamics that shape the future of nuclear non-proliferation and regional security. At the international level, non-proliferation norms are built on agreements such as the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which aim to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons while allowing peaceful nuclear energy development under strict safeguards. Within this framework, the IAEA plays a central role by verifying compliance through comprehensive safeguard agreements and, where adopted, the additional protocol, which enhances the agency's ability to detect undeclared activities. The prospect of a major U.S. ally like Saudi Arabia obtaining advanced nuclear technology without committing to the highest level of safeguards has raised alarms among international observers who fear it could weaken the authority of the IAEA and subordinate robust global standards to bilateral arrangements lacking universal transparency. Such a shift could embolden other countries seeking similar concessions, thereby increasing the complexity of monitoring nuclear activities worldwide. The Middle East strategic landscape further amplifies these concerns. Regional rivalries, especially between Saudi Arabia and Iran, have long influenced security calculations and statements from Saudi leaders that the kingdom would pursue nuclear weapons if Iran were to acquire them underscore the potential for arms competition. A U.S. civil nuclear cooperation deal that permits sensitive capabilities without strict limits could be interpreted by some states as tacit acceptance of a broader range of nuclear activities, diminishing the incentive for restraint and complicating efforts to manage proliferation risks. External powers also watch these developments closely. Russia, China, and other nuclear-armed states are expanding their strategic and commercial footprints in the global nuclear sector, while traditional arms control agreements between the United States and other nuclear powers have weakened or lapsed altogether. In this fluid environment, decisions regarding nuclear cooperation with Saudi Arabia carry implications for U.S. credibility on non-proliferation, its ability to influence global nuclear governance, and the perceptions of allies and adversaries alike. Critics argue that weakening safeguards in the name of advancing a civil nuclear deal could inadvertently contribute to a new era of nuclear competition and diplomatic friction, making it harder to build consensus on curbing proliferation and securing nuclear materials. Supporters contend that engaging Saudi Arabia in a structured cooperation arrangement under U.S. oversight is preferable to leaving the kingdom to develop nuclear capabilities independently or align with other suppliers with less transparent safeguards. They also argue that robust bilateral verification measures tailored to specific contexts can, in practice, offer effective monitoring while aligning with U.S. strategic interests. Ultimately, the decision on how to balance these competing priorities, non-proliferation norms, regional security dynamics, economic and strategic cooperation, and global nuclear governance, will influence how the world navigates the complex intersection of peaceful nuclear energy use and the imperative to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons technology.